Okay, so we're going to talk about event listeners, and you've done these several times, and on some of the other projects that we've done in class. So here is an example of one thing that an event listener can do. We've talked about assigning an event listener to a button. You can also assign a mouse over event. There's probably, I don't know how many, 100 different event listeners that you can use, such as mouse over, mouse out, mouse enter, mouse leave. And here's an example of mouse enter, mouse leave event listener. You can see it looks just like a hover effect in CSS, but it's actually all being done with JavaScript, just to make the point that event listeners can be done for many, many different purposes. So if we look at the actual code that's going on here, get to the right window. The first one that we're looking at is this syntax right here. And before I get onto that, let me, I should have mentioned this also earlier. I sent you out a JavaScript cheat sheet on the Slack channel. And what I'd like you guys to do is keep that open as you're coding. It's very much like the one that we saw the other day, or the one that I sent out in Word. Here it is right here. This one, for example, we're talking about events. So when you click, and you can actually open it in your IDE environment. So you can open it as a text file. When you click on events and you go to Command D, that takes you right to samples of event code. And the reason I'm thinking it will be helpful to have this open while you're actually coding is there's a bunch of code that you can copy and paste into whatever project you're working on right now. And it gives you just a little demonstration of a working version of, in this case, an event listener. So it's not a complete document. It's not going to tell you how they all work and all that. You have to get all that information from the handouts, from the readings, and the labs. But it's just a go-to reference that you can actually use while you're coding. I'm thinking of it as an active document and sort of a reference as to what you should really know by the end of this class. So for example here, now this code actually comes from the thing we're doing right now. There's a little piece that talks about a little hover effect. And so that code right there is an example of assigning an event listener to, in this case, an element called main. Where did that element come from? If you look up in the code here, there's JavaScript that, and we've talked about this before, getting an element by ID. So there's our JavaScript, defining that as a variable called main, getting it by the ID main. Doesn't matter. It's actually, I think the actual tag is main. It could be a div, could be a peak tag, whatever. But the idea is that we've got it into the JavaScript environment, and then down here we can add an event listener to it, which in this case is a mouse enter event listener. So if you guys were doing this lab, here's a piece of code you could copy and paste, at least as a starting point for solving some of the issues of the lab. So, and as you, whoops, sorry, let me go here. So that's the code that we're actually dealing with, and as you can see, what's going on there is it's saying that we're going to listen for a mouse enter event. When that happens, the second argument for the event listener code is going to fire, which means it's going to activate that function there. That function is going to put a console log line down. It's going to do some styling in the background red and the color white. And when you look at that little effect on the web page, that's what happens. The text goes to white, the color goes to red. That's being triggered by a mouse enter event, and when the mouse leaves, which is a mouse leave event, I'll just expand these so you can see, it goes back to its other color. So, does that code? I mean, it's something you have to practice using in different situations, but. Take that on as something that you'll put it into your bag of tricks. That's going to be a regular thing that you'll feel comfortable using as you do go through these projects. Notice that I've got two different event listeners here. I mentioned mouse enter, mouse leave is the other one. They're both working to do those styling changes that we saw. Okay, so here's an example of where we're using two different event listeners on the same element, main to do two different effects, color it and then return the color to normal. So here's another example here that they have. Yeah.
I just want to take that in.
Okay.
So if the button was one color and you just had the event listener for mouse enter, it would then change the button to another color and then leave it that way. Is that why you need the leave?
That is correct.
And that's why it functions like a hover, because it allows it to go back to the way it was, but otherwise it would be black and then you'd cross your mouse over it and it would just change color and then stay that way.
Let me see if I can make that happen here. I just canceled that code that changes it back. There's the color, and it's stuck.
Good catch.
So, yeah, that was exactly it. Just like a switch. Yep. Yep. So you need both of those in this case for that particular thing. So yeah, that's good. That's a good question. And notice that these lines of code are necessary to actually make those change. We're going to the elements. We're doing the style thing on it. We can do any style in CSS that we want. Change the size, make it grow big, whatever. But we're just using colors here. So that's an example of where it's a specific event listener with doing a specific thing, but you can apply that style concept to do other kinds of styling things. If you want to change the font, change the whatever. So when you get to a point where, gee, I got to do this thing that I haven't seen before, but here's an example of where maybe a similar thing will give you the format to use. So that's okay. So that's that. Here's one that deals with keys. This is a key down event listener. So we're going to go to this little input here, and watch what happens when I type. Well, we're getting text, but we're also getting, on the console, we're getting a response. In other words, JavaScript knows that we actually typed something, and this little thing here, e.which, I got to talk about e in a second, but e.which is putting up a number. Anybody have an idea what those numbers might mean? They're different for every key. Any concept? Every key has a built-in number. I think it's called a key code. It's the universal some blah blah key code. So it tells you what letter you're dealing with. That's how the computer knows. So in our this is the thing they had in the lab. Right here, here's the event listener. Again, two arguments. The actual event it's listening for, and then the function that responds to that event. By the way, the second argument goes all the way from here down to there. Remember, we talked about arguments. Those are the things. We've also talked about passers and receivers. So you're going to call a function. You're going to pass that function a variable or something. That function is going to receive it. The term for those passing and receiving variables is argument. So when I say argument, that's what I mean. The key down is the first argument. That's what type of event it is. The second argument is the function, which goes all the way down from curly bracket to curly bracket, basically. So that function is an example of an anonymous function. It's got the entire code for the function written out there as part of the event listener code. And we've seen in the past, and I don't think I have any examples on this in this little demo thing here, but you can actually name your functions and put the function name here and then just go call that function and define it some other place in your code. So when I say named function, does that make sense to you? Let me see if I have an example of a named function. I don't think I have any code open right now that shows that, but it's just basically where you say function space get username or something. That's a named function. So rather than write it all out like this, you can have it call a named function. Anyway, so there's a...
Meaning
sorry?
like it's saved somewhere else, and then so you can bring it in easily there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Function get user, and as you say, save somewhere else. There's a function save somewhere else.
Right.
The function's name is get user, so I could go like that and just put get user right there. And that would call that function, and that function would do all the stuff that we wanted it to do. I find this a much cleaner way to do it because it doesn't mess up your event listener with all that code that's sort of specific to the function. But there's advantages and disadvantages. So the first lab pretty much deals with these kinds of event lister things. There's another thing that the lab talks about, which is this term called prevent default. And without going into the detail of what this is, think about a situation where you have a bunch of buttons, say, on a website, and you want the user to log in and be able to click and do various things, but let's say they can't access the administrative page or something if they're not an administrator. So the default thing on your buttons may be that a button responds to a click event. Let's say you wanted it to not happen in the case where you have somebody who's not an administrator of your lab. You could prevent what the default behavior is with this line right here, prevent default. The more common example that I'm aware of is when you're clicking on a link and you don't want the person to be able to go to a particular link for some reason. You want to disable the link. When you click on a link, it goes to whatever that link is sending you to. If you want to prevent that, its default condition being open up a new web page, using prevent default will prevent you from doing that. So that's a good thing to be aware of. Now, I said I was going to talk about E. Let me go back up here. This is a built-in, I guess it's an object. It's the event object. That's what E stands for. Just like we said that there's an array object. Arrays have all kinds of built-in functionality that you can take advantage of. The document object, that has all kinds of stuff. The event object has all kinds of stuff. And in a second, I'll show you an example of what it has. But it is part of the function that responds to an event. And you can grab it by using a variable inside the parentheses there. Often you see it spelled out as event, but it's common practice to also use it as an E. So basically what that means, just like the passer and the receiver situation, if you pass a variable from the place where you call a function to the place where the function is receiving that variable, that's sort of what the event is doing. This function is receiving the event object from the presence of the mouse enter. The mouse entered, triggers an event, there's the event object. This function is receiving it, and that means we can do stuff with it. Now in this function, in this event listener here, we're not doing anything with the event. We're dealing with styles there. Down here, we are dealing with the event. This is one of the many event methods, is the which method. What does that mean? Well, that tells you what the number of the key is when you push it down. So if we did, like I have this one going on key up. We're listening for key down here. We're listening for key up here, the two different events actually, and you can use that in video games and things, like when you click on something and hold it down, that's one event, and the up doesn't trigger until you release. So if there's some little thing you wanted to do with that, this is the way you would do that with events. So on this one I have an e-which printing out, and if I remember this, if I have this set up correctly, let me clear this out here. So I'm going to just type a key. That one was the 8 key. There's the U key, 85. The T key is 84. H key, 72. E-which is just giving you those numbers. Now you might say, well, what situation would I care about what the number is? That's the way that a hacker, for example, can pick up your password by looking at what key did you type, what code does it generate. If a hacker was able to implant JavaScript code onto your web page, which is one of the techniques that they use, they could steal all the numbers of your key down, as you're typing your password and go off and do stuff with it. So one little thing they have on this demo thing here with the lab is if I hit the G key, notice nothing is happening. Notice I'm not seeing the G key here. I'm still getting the event. It's still recognizing that I'm hitting this key, but nothing is happening. You might say, well, why is that? If we go here and look at the code, we have a little filter going on here. This is just part of the lab, so I just included it here. It's an example of a conditional statement, which we talked about using an if. In this case, we're saying if the key number is 71, guess what character that might be? It's the G character. If it's 71, you can put up the fact that it's a G key, but here we have returning the prevent default that I mentioned earlier. We're basically saying The default key is to, or the default response here when you type something into an input box is to put a character there. That's the default behavior of an input box responding to the events of a character being typed. But with the G key, that response is being prevented. So that's just an example of how that's actually used in actual code. Okay, now there's one other thing. I'll get to that in a second. Here,
prevent default, is that a method? That's a built-in method?
Built-in method, yep. So if we look at that line, the E is sort of subtle. I usually write it out so you can see it better, but E dot prevents default. That's where it comes from. And when we get to, let me try this. I have this someplace else. I'm just going to show you E all by itself. So this will trigger on the key up. Let me just clear this out here. So I'm just going to hit some random key. Oh, it didn't. Oh, I didn't reload it. Okay. Good old E, plain old event. Look at all of the stuff you can do with events. And prevent default. Default prevented. That's not. I'm not finding it here. It may be under. Oh, it was preventing a return in the way the code was used, so it may not be showing up here. Anyway, these are all the things that you can get to inside an event. I'm sorry, that's actually. We're going to talk about targets in a second. So, in fact, we're going to do that right now. So let me show you one more thing. Here's a situation where on this website, we have all of these divs here. This is sort of an artificial example. We just have a bunch of divs inside divs. A more real example would be a menu where you have menu items, a whole bunch of menu items going on, and you want to respond to those menu items. So you might think, well, you could assign an event listener to each one. So if that was a list of menu items, notice as I click on this, it's turning the box a color, and it's putting a bunch of stuff up there on the side. So each one of those divs, you could say each one of those divs has an event listener on it. But that is not a good way to do this, because that means you have, first of all, you have 5 different event listeners listening for a click event, which can cause some complications. There's also a thing called bubbling and capturing, which is that the event that you trigger actually starts migrating around your website and looks for other elements that might be looking for the same event. And it'll migrate all the way up the tree or all the way down the tree, depending on whether you're doing what's called bubbling or capturing. And it could cause other behavior that you don't want. And I'll show you that in a second here. One thing you can do that's a little more efficient, makes a little more sense, is to assign the event listener to the parent element. So if we look at the code there, I know I'm jumping around here a lot, but here's the code, the HTML, here's the HTML for those little boxes I added. And as you can see, there's a container div right here, and that div contains all of these other divs. And instead of assigning the click event listener to each one of those divs individually, what you can do is assign it to the container div. And a container div is a parent. It's a parent of whatever child divs it's having. And you can think of it as a parent who's monitoring the kids as they're sitting around there, and if any one of them gets hit by an event, the parent will know, oh, you just got some event happen to you. Somebody clicked or moused over or whatever. That means that the event is recognized, and you can actually respond to that in JavaScript by taking advantage of the event. So here's the code that does that. Here's the parent. I'm just getting the parent with a get element by ID, as we've done before. I'm adding an event listener to that parent. Click. This is the example of the named function we were talking about. That's going to call respond to click function, putting our console log line there. Here is where I'm trying to go with this. These are 2 really useful pieces of code for dealing with specific elements on your web page. There's 2 of them. One is called target, and one is called current target. And I always have a hard time remembering which one is which. But they're both useful, and this is where we can see an example of. Let me reload this. What the difference is. So I'm going to click on event or box number 1 here. And let me get rid of the E for a second. That's distracting. What that's showing me is the target, the thing I clicked on, which is usually the thing you want to know about, is div number 1. When I click on div number 2, the target is div number 2. Div number 5, the target is div number 5. So that's allowing the JavaScript to deal with the actual thing you clicked on. So you can see if this was a menu, you'd be going to the correct place on your menu that you chose. Notice, however, in the current target for every one of these is the container, this box that surrounds all of those divs. Sometimes, well, I'm only really pointing that out just to show you that the event, the element that's actually responding to the event is the parent element. It's the thing that you're clicking on. You could click anywhere. In fact, if I click over here, notice that that's turning the entire parent element a color, and I didn't really, it's still responding to an event. There may be times when you want to capture the entire box area that's you know, for some reason you want to grab a whole bunch of stuff or make it a large area where people can click and do various things. So that's just an efficient way of putting many event listeners onto, or one event listener onto many elements. Let me just go, yeah.
Is this only applicable to elements of the same, that are the same, like the parent is div and then the children are divs? Only
in the parent, but they can be different kinds of elements. Okay. Yeah, so p tags, photographs, whatever, all that stuff, as long as it's a child. Yep. And which brings up the issue of, well, what if you didn't want something to respond to a click? Say you had a picture in there and you wanted that to be not active. That's where you might use prevent default. Like it responded to the click, but oh, we're not going to go there. Yep. Okay. So anyway, that's a sort of a very quick and dirty overview of events, or you know, of a couple ways that events are applied. Let me jump to this one here, which is also going to talk about events, but this is a different context, or events thought of in a different way. When you load a web page, you do it sequentially. This is a very simple web page. There's the HTML. We have a style sheet and a JSS and a JavaScript sheet. But many web pages have many style sheets. Not 3 or 5, 10 style sheets. They can have a whole bunch of different JavaScripts. They can be huge, massive, thousands of lines, piles of code that all have to load. And the thing is, if you're loading, it all happens in a flash, but if you're the browser, you're operating in milliseconds, the time actually makes a difference. And one of the things that can happen is if you start running your JavaScript to refer to elements on the page, what happens if those elements haven't loaded yet? Photograph, for example, we have a big, beautiful picture of something. The browser's got to load those all on. If you have a click event on that photograph or something, the JavaScript will get confused. And sure enough, this is what's happening in this case. The code, and I'll show you the code in a second, it's basically saying you're trying to add an event listener onto something that doesn't exist. So here's the code. This is JavaScript code. Let body element be that. Add the event listener to the body element. What it's saying is there is no body element. And the reason is because this code is firing as soon as we see the JavaScript. There's the link to the JavaScript. In this particular case, it's up there in the head of the document. Reading from top to bottom, reads a bunch of stuff. Oh, I got a script here. What's the script telling me to do? It's telling me to assign an event listener to the body. Well, the body is down here. It hasn't loaded yet. So there's an error. You're trying to do something that has not occurred. You're operating on an element that is not yet on your page. So how do you fix that? You go back to this, and you comment out all that bad code, and you uncomment the cool code, which is right here. Okay, this is yet another event. This one is the DOM content loaded event. And that's got like a fancy name, but it's just another event like anything else. This one says, listen to see when is this document fully loaded. And I should say, when is the HTML part of the document fully loaded? And parsed, meaning it's been sort of set up as part of the DOM object, the document object model. So don't do anything until that event has triggered. And that event is, your browser will trigger that event. Browsers can respond to things just like JavaScript can or elements on your page can. So when that event gets triggered, then it reads this code. And this is the same code we had before, but this time it's inside this event listener. So now, hopefully, when we load this, okay, we got a bug. Line 11. Let's do some debugging here. I have a comment. I uncommented my comment. Okay. So there it says DOM loaded. So that's just telling me that it responded to the event. And when I click on this, this is from the lab. Whoever wrote the lab was really into reggae, obviously. So we're doing reggae. I like reggae too. But, so anyway, obviously in this case it's responding to the clicks because it knows about the body loaded, and all that. Just so you're aware, you don't have to really know this. I think this is not really part of the lab, but there are a couple other ways to do this as well. And you can, whoops. Down here we have an event on the window. Remember, there's the document, which has all kinds of stuff going on. There's also the window. That's like the big Uber object that surrounds the document, which you do sometimes use when you want to figure out how big is the person's window that they're looking through in the browser, like cell phone, tablet, computer. Window has that kind of information. The viewport, it's called. In this case, it's the load event that the window has. It's different from the documents. It's a slightly different thing, but just so you know that there's several different ways you can do this. They all have advantages and disadvantages. On this one, whoops, go here to, that's next week. Where did I have that? I'm on the wrong lab, sorry. I think it was this lab. And by the way, what you're looking at here is a stripped down version of the lab instructions, and I added this part here, which basically explains the difference between those two events. The window load triggers when the entire page and all of its resources have loaded, meaning the entire JavaScript, all of the photographs, all of the CSS files, every single thing is done, and the window load, if you need for some reason to wait for the entire package to be there, you can use that window load event to wait till it's all loaded. The document content loaded event only triggers when you have the HTML part as part of the document object model. So there's slight differences, and you really won't have to. So I'm really just saying this just to be aware of it. There's a couple other things to mention there as well, but you can look at that later when you go into the lab. Okay, so let's do an actual lab, and I'm going to introduce this one by talking about a very new concept. Which, well, first of all, any questions on what we just talked about on the document loading events? I know you still got to work with it and actually use it a few times to really get it, but we're now going to shift gears. Let me make sure I haven't forgotten anything here. Yeah, we're going to talk about JSON. Okay. So, what is JSON? JSON is something that allows you to do stuff like this. This is Weather Underground. We're actually going to do a lab using this website, I think next week. This is a website that allows you to find out all kinds of stuff about weather all over the world. And it sends it to you in a JSON file, which is this. This is just an example that they have. This is weather from San Francisco. Right now, the wind is 22 miles an hour. Wow, that's pretty fast. You can't land a plane in 22-mile-an-hour winds. A small plane. You can land a large plane. But this format here looks sort of like a JavaScript object. We have curly brackets, and we have code that goes down. This is not a really good example. Let me go to the lab example, where they have a nice sample of JSON code for a recipe. The particulars are important. Here's an example of JSON code. It starts with curly brackets and has everything surrounded by quotes. We're seeing key value pairs, similar to the objects we use in JavaScript, where we have name, colon, person's name, age, colon, person's age. Here we have recipe title, grilled cheese, cool. Except in this case, they're in quotes separated by a colon. You can have multiple different kinds of variables or variable values in the file, but they all have to be text. So here's an array. Ingredients, see the square bracket? Down here is the closing square bracket. That's enclosing the ingredients for this recipe. The ingredients themselves are objects, or are very much like objects. They're still JSON, it's a JSON file, so it's not really specifically the same kind of object as in JavaScript, but similar but different. So anyway, notice that they're also surrounded by curly brackets, also key value pairs, name, bread, quantity 2, units, slices, okay? That's just the structure that a JSON file provides. And these are used all over the place in the internet. So if you ever get into a situation where you're dealing with data, which you will be, and the data could come from any place in the world, could be sports scores, could be recipes, could be cancer research study values or whatever. It can be obtained through the API that we're going to talk about next week. It's basically go out, give me some data, bring it back. It comes back to you as a JSON file. So the question is, for the lab you're going to do today, how do you then deal with a JSON file in your web page? And so that's basically what we're going to talk about. And you deal with it by, well, let me show you the way the lab looks for now. This is the actual lab that you're going to do. I'm sort of giving away to show these pictures here, but basically they've put down film rating and description, which is pretty generic. Doesn't really help much. The lab is all about filling that with actual data that came from someplace. Now, we're not going to deal with getting it from the internet. The file is provided for you, so you can just use it right there. But if you want to see about Titanic, you do that. There's the Titanic. Or if you want to see about, actually, I was on a cruise ship once in my life. It didn't really look like that. It was more old-fashioned. But okay, Terminator. There's the Terminator, sort of cute version. And the idea is to get that specific data from some file, which is a JSON file, and stick it into the web page. So, how do we go about doing that? Let me go back to the code here. Sorry, I'm trying to find. Okay, so at this point, why don't you guys go to this lab? This is the HTML, I'm sorry, the JSON, what do they call it?
I only have 4 labs.
Yeah, we are skipping the first. Let me see where this is.
What I want to say is I don't have a JSON lab. I have a DOM event listening. I have a Konami code lab. I have document onload.
Yeah.
I think it's this one.
So
this one here.
We didn't get rendering HTML using JSON. We only got the JavaScript eventing. We didn't get the rendering HTML, the JavaScript password, and then it's.
Oh, you didn't get that. Oh man.
Oh wait, I just refreshed and now it's there.
You know, but here's the page where I sent it out. It's, you know what? Wow. Okay. Let me try sending this out again. If you don't have it, all right, here we go. Deploy. Source repo does not exist. Okay. Okay, that's puzzling. So let's close the one you just did for the events. Let's open the sandbox and let's. Let me send out the code to you, the code that you're going to need to do this for sure.
Oh, you can't redo. You can't send all out again.
I just tried. I can try reloading this file. This is something I'm going to have to put in there's a place where I can put in a fault problem and let them know so that they sort of fix it behind the scenes. But before we wait for that to happen, let me try making sure everything is deployed here. So we're in number 6. I'm just going to go ahead and deploy all of these. Actually, just in case that's part of the issue, let me just only deploy this one. By the way, some of you, oh shit, that's the wrong, never mind. Let me pick the correct, this is something I do all the time. I have to choose the DC version here. So,
Should we, in our sandbox, create just an index for HTML, CSS, and Java?
what I was going to say is I was going to send you out, I have all of those files already done, and I can send you those directly if we can't get them from the lab here. Let me see if, I'll try this one more time, and then I'll just go ahead and do that. Whoops. So JavaScript, create HTML, deploy. Unfortunately, if I leave these unchecked, these other ones, they get undeployed. So, okay, I got the right class. Cloning sources. Okay. Yeah, don't know what's going on there. So let me see what we can do. But in the meantime, I'm going to send you out these files. I'm going to have to do that like this. All copy. Okay, that's one. Let me send that one. I'm doing this quick and dirty, so I'm not labeling them. But okay, here is the CSS file. Okay. So sorry about that. Not sure why that lab didn't deploy, but you can now open the sandbox in your IDE and go to open those two files in there. And what's puzzling is, well, I get mine from a different source. I guess that's the issue there. So one thing that's could be good about this is a process of going through and looking at the web page and what you're trying to do with the web page, and then trying to tie that to the JavaScript that's going to perform the function that you're trying to do. So here's our JavaScript file. You guys don't have this because I didn't send you the JavaScript file, but in your little cheat sheet that I sent out, which is here, if you go to Events and do a Command D to drop down to Events, there should be an example of code that has the, where is it? Oh, did I not put this on here? The thing we were just talking about with the loading of the page, I don't see it. I'm going to have to send this out to you separately. Well, maybe you can just type this directly off the screen. I know that's less than ideal. Okay, let's just do this quickly by typing this into the JavaScript file. So you're going to need an index.js file in addition to your index.html and index.css files. And we're going to add an event listener, so it's on the document dot. The event we're doing is DOM content loaded. I should point out this particular format we're using here is an arrow function. It's a slightly different format than the one that has the function keyword specified. So in order not to confuse things, let me just go back to that. Let me do it like this. You guys will be more familiar with this. That's just the function keyword. It still has the curly brackets. And an important little detail here is the last line there in line 4. You've got a curly bracket and a parenthesis. So make sure you get both of those there. And okay, so what you guys have just done is you've just told your JavaScript code that you're not going to do anything with JavaScript until the document is loaded, until the HTML part has been parsed by the browser and is all sort of ready to go. So then, now we're at the point where we want to actually figure out what do we want this thing to do. So first thing that I did was I clicked on those buttons to choose my movie. Now, by the way, obviously that could use some CSS styling. If somebody wants to maybe fix those buttons so they can look a little better, you could do that with CSS eventually, but just focusing on the JavaScript. Given that I want to click on some buttons, what is the first thing you want to do? What JavaScript method would you do to make those buttons actually do something that we've talked about? How do you give them behavior? How do you make them respond to an event?
Do a get element by ID to find out what they are.
Yes, as a starting point. So good. See if you guys can, oh, so why don't you guys do that? See if you can figure out what elements are we talking about there. We know they're buttons. We know that one of them says Titanic, one of them says Terminator. See if you can figure out how do I get those buttons into the JavaScript file that you're writing. Now, let me remind you that you have this cheat sheet here. So think about what we're trying to do. We are trying to get the buttons activated, but before we do that, we have to actually bring the buttons into our JavaScript world, which means we need to interact with the, here we go, select DOM elements, or document object model elements. If we go to Command D there, it brings us down here. So if you have this file open, your cheat sheet, you could go directly down to line 229. This is an example, so it's not the same code, but it's telling you that you can get an element by ID. That's the syntax there. Oh, missing a parenthesis. Do that. Missing a semicolon. We're storing that element in a thing called main title here, but in your code you want to give it some other title, since you're going to be interacting with one of those buttons. So what do you have to do to figure out, well, which button am I trying to deal with? How do I find out what element that is? Or there's actually two different ways you can do that. How would I?
Go to the HTML file.
HTML file, that's one of them. Yep, cool. So here's our HTML. Do you know what the other one is? Inspect, yes. Two different techniques for finding an element. Here's the HTML file, and sure enough, right at the top of our page there, under the nav elements, we have a couple of buttons. Titanic. The key thing you're looking for is these right here. Those are the IDs. That's how you know these buttons as opposed to some other buttons. So that's telling you what the buttons are. Going back to your JavaScript, if I was going to go to my little cheat sheet there, I would go grab this thing here, go back to my JavaScript, paste it in there, and remember the ID was two different IDs. Titanic is one. Let me put that one in there. Let's call it Titanic button. And by the way, I'm highlighting that capital T there. Anybody know why I'm pointing out that there's a capital T on my variable?
They need to match exactly because they'd be different with the lowercase t, like they're recognized.
It's important that it be lowercase, but in this case, it doesn't. This does not have to match that. The issue is variable names should start with a lowercase. That's just one of those things to remember. With the exception of class variables, that's that's for a different day. So there's my Titanic button. Since I want to make one for Terminator, copy and paste, same deal. Go here, double click on. Actually, I can't double click because it has a space there. Now here's something. This is an aside, but here's something you should never do. You should never have a space in an ID. A quick and easy way to deal with that is to underline it like that. That way you still have all the information there. If for some reason you care it's Terminator, there's no Terminator 3, or is there? Did they make a 3 of those? I don't think they did.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, they did.
They did?
It's not good.
Huh.
They did.
Because I liked the first two. I thought they were both really good, but
True.
I guess didn't miss anything for number 3.
You didn't. No.
Okay, good.
There might have been a 4.
They changed. There's a 3 and then there's Genesis.
Oh, it's a franchise now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the way in movies. Just get a franchise going, and then you can crank out more. That you can have a cool house there in Beverly Hills with the pool and the view. And, oh man. Okay. Let's see. Where was I? I wanted to be here. I wanted to be in Jobs here. So I was trying to copy that. Copy. You got some buttons? What do we want to do with those buttons? We want to give them behavior. Oop, I got a bug here. Anybody see this? I have two Titanic buttons. I'm just going to call this Terminator button, lowercase. So what do we want these buttons to do? Or how do we make these buttons do something? We want them to respond to a click event. So, event listener, yep, cool. And easiest way to do it, given that we have the cheat sheet, go to, I always just go back up to the top, so I can't remember where these things are, what lines they are. Here's events. I'm just going to grab whatever one that comes up here first. Here's, let's get element by ID. Here we go, add event listener. This format has a named function, which is a clean little format, so that's a good one to grab. So copy that one, bring that over into our lab, paste that one in. Again, the syntax here is we are putting the listener onto an element. Our two elements are currently stored in those two variables. Variable one being Titanic button. So let's work with that one first. I want to grab that button and have that one be the thing that the event listener is assigned to. So I copied Titanic button and pasted that in over what I had there was menu. Doesn't, you may have used a different source for your JavaScript, so you might have a different thing to copy there. But this is a click event listener, and it's going to do a function, in this case called respond to click. Considering that we want this button to show us a movie. Oh, I've disabled my code now, so it doesn't do anything. But we want that to fill in all the Titanic data there. Okay, so considering that that's what we want it to do, what would be a better name for this function?
Load movie?
Load movie. I love it. Load movie. Let's call it load movie data, because that's really what we're doing. So we're going to have a function called load movie data. That means since we're going to call that function as the result of a click, what do we now need to do in order for this not to produce an error? In theory, that event listener is now going to, we'll do this as a debugging thing. In theory, we have an event listener on the Titanic button. So if I think this has reloaded. Let me open up the thing here. Well, the console is giving me a hand before I even had to do anything there. Obviously, we had an error there. What is that error telling us?
There's no function.
There's no function. Exactly right. I'm referring to a function that doesn't exist. So again, back in our code, let's make that function. So here we are, back in the code. We're going to copy it and paste it so we don't make any typos. Remember, the syntax for function is function and a couple parentheses, then a space and a couple of curly brackets. Opening up, we want to always put our console log line in, and we have one right there for free from our document loaded event. So we can grab that one, put that into line 10 there, grab the, actually I made a mistake here. Let me correct this in a second. We're going to take the name of the function and paste it here. Now, anybody notice the mistake I made on line 9? You'd have to know the syntax in order to recognize that, so you may not recognize it right away, but I interposed these words. Function starts, and there's no space. That's what I should have done. Function keyword first, name of the function that you're writing, and then the parentheses and the curly brackets and the console log. So now I got my function defined. I'll leave that up there so you guys can see. And by the way, there is function code available on the handout. So again, and I think this is a good thing to practice, using that cheat sheet to actually go and grab code, like you can't remember the syntax for a function, which you may not have memorized at this point. Grab something that you know works and then paste it in and then modify it accordingly. So, okay, we're going to load the movie data. Now, where is our data coming from? I started off this whole thing by talking about JSON, data that would come down from Weather Underground or come from some sports site or something, or from a file, which is where we have it here. The question is, how do I get my file into the JavaScript code? And the answer is actually, this is something you may not, that I didn't point out and you wouldn't know without having pointed it out. I'm going back to the HTML file. And down here, like we've seen before, we have a script tag that's how our index.js file, the one we're writing right now, that's how that file gets connected to this HTML document in that script tag right there. Right above it, we have movies.json. That is how the JSON data is coming into this particular website. It's just a file sitting on the computer. It grabs that file, pulls whatever is in that file into the environment, and allows you to have access to it. So the name of the file is movies.json, and the content of the file is a variable called movies. So I just clicked on that file. Now, you know what? You guys don't have this file. So I need to send this file to you as well. We're going to take a break pretty soon. While you guys are on break, before my computer goes to sleep, because I forgot to plug in the power. Okay. While you guys are on break, I will try to deal with this issue with the lab behind the scenes. But anyway, meanwhile, let me get this file. You're going to need this JSON file. So new, paste, save as. Okay, so back here, going to here. Movies.json, there's the file. Okay, I'll give you a couple seconds to grab that code, and you want to make a new file, paste that code into that file, and very importantly, make sure when you save it that you save it as movies.json, because our our index.html file is looking for a file called movies.json. It's gonna. I don't know where you've saved the files that we're working on right now, the index files. All of these should be in the same folder for right now, with the exception of the CSS file. But let's deal with that later. And if you haven't done this already, in Chrome, go to Chrome, open a new window, and do file open. Open the HTML file that is going along with this lab, so the index.html file that we're using. Open that file in Chrome, and you'll find that your CSS is not going to work because there's a little glitch we got to take care of with that. Don't worry about that. It's an easy fix. And then you'll find if you open up the Option Command J will open up the console. That will show you how your JavaScript is doing, and if you have any typos or bugs or whatever, you'll be able to see what's going on there. So let me know if you're having any kind of trouble opening your index.html file in Chrome. It's not going to look like that because of the issue with the CSS file, but we'll take care of that in a second.
Yeah, everything is like no formatting, everything's black.
Yes. Okay, so here's the fix. Going to your HTML file. At the top, we have line 7, linking your style sheet. However, it's assuming it's in a styles folder because in the lab, that's where it is. Styles inside index.css. Since yours is not in a styles folder, you can either create a styles folder and put it in there, or lose the styles. So I would say lose the styles. Just take that line of code right out. That'll give your script or your HTML file access to the CSS file.
Do you want the JSON in its own file, or do you want it input in the CSS or HTML?
I'm glad you asked. We do want it in its own file. Yep. So movies.json will be just a separate file, and it is important to call it .json. By the way, I didn't explain what JSON stands for, mainly because I don't probably remember. It's JavaScript object notation, I think is what it is. You can look that up, but it's a specific. Good. Yeah. So separate file. Hopefully the line in your index.html file at the bottom, these two lines will pull in your script and the movies file, which means that when you're in index.html, you should have access to the movies variable. So in order to check that, here's one way we can do it, quick and dirty. We're going to copy the command line, console log line, paste it in there. I'm going to say, since I'm checking a variable now, I'm going to do this like this. I'm going to say movies to identify what variable I'm checking. I'm then going to say outside the quotes. Very important that the movies and the colon be in quotes because it's just a label. Comma, paste. That's the actual movies variable. So the question is, does your JavaScript code see that variable right there? That is the object that's inside the movies.json file. And when you run your code in the command line in the JavaScript console, you should see a value for that variable there. So let me just try to run that. There it is. Notice that because I printed it out there, it allows me to open up this file and see exactly what was inside it. That's on the command line side. Notice that it's very different from the actual the way the actual JSON file itself is written. This has now been brought into the JavaScript world. It's part of the document object model. So the format is slightly different, but the content is the same as it was in that file, which means that you guys have access to it. Is anybody not getting that part? Yeah. Yeah, no, this is a lot of stuff to type, and I'm doing a lot of bouncing around. So we'll do, once we have everybody with the movies file data coming in, then we'll take a quick break, and then we'll talk about the real meat of the issue, which is getting JSON into our website. In fact, I'm going to stop the streaming for right now.